The first battle of a war doesn't always make headlines, but it can decide everything that follows. In the early hours of March 21st, 2003, as darkness still blanketed southern Iraq, the silence broke with gunfire near a small, unknown port town. That town was Qasr, and it would become the first place where coalition boots hit the ground and bullets flew in the Iraq War. This was not Baghdad. It wasn't a capital or a palace, but what happened here would open the gates for everything that followed: logistics, aid, and the march to topple Saddam Hussein. The fight to control this single stretch of coastline would involve elite forces from three nations, and what was expected to take hours dragged on for days. Before we dive into how this forgotten corner of Iraq became the first showdown of the 2003 invasion, hit the subscribe button. Most of our viewers aren't subscribed yet, and we've got a ton of powerful military history stories like this one coming up. If you're into raw, real battlefield history, you won't want to miss what's next. Qasr sits quietly near the southern border with Kuwait. In 2003, it was Iraq's only deep-water port, making it a critical asset for any invasion strategy. Control the port, and you control the country's gateway to the sea. That's why, in the opening hours of the war, British Royal Marines, U.S. Marines, and Polish Special Forces were sent in together to strike fast and take it before the Iraqis could react. But the resistance they met was tougher than expected. What began as a textbook military landing quickly turned into a brutal urban engagement. Over the next 5 days, coalition forces would face sniper attacks, hidden fighters, and a town determined not to fall easily. This is the story of the first true battle of the Iraq War. This is the Battle of Qasr. Qasr is a modest port town in southern Iraq, sitting right on the edge of the Persian Gulf near the Kuwaiti border. In 2003, it had a population of around 43,000 people. Ordinary families, port workers, shopkeepers, and fishermen. On the surface, it seemed like any quiet coastal town, but its position gave it massive importance. Unlike most of Iraq, Qasr had direct access to the sea. It was Iraq's only deep-water port capable of receiving large cargo ships. A narrow channel linked the docks to the Gulf, making it a lifeline for oil exports and supply deliveries. The town was also connected by rail and road to major cities like Basra, turning it into a key hub for logistics. Geographically, the town was divided into two main zones. The newer industrial port area sat near the coast, with large storage yards, warehouses, and broad roads built for trucks and cranes. Inland, the older residential district was much denser. Narrow alleys, close-packed homes, and a tangled street layout made it a nightmare for vehicles, and perfect for defenders. This mix of modern port access and tight urban terrain made Qasr a tactical hotspot and one of the first targets of the invasion. Qasr wasn't always a centerpiece in Iraq's strategy, but history forced it into the spotlight. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iraq's western ports near Iran became too dangerous. As a result, Saddam Hussein's regime began expanding Qasr to serve as the country's primary outlet to the sea. What had once been a quiet fishing town began transforming into a strategic military and economic node. After the Gulf War in 1991, the town gained even more importance. Southern cities like Basra had risen up against Saddam during the uprisings, and in response, the regime punished them by redirecting investment elsewhere. Qasr, seen as more secure and less rebellious, became the focus. Over the next decade, it received infrastructure upgrades, including an expanded dock and a dredged shipping channel deep enough for large ocean-going vessels. By 2003, Qasr had grown into a modern working port. Under the United Nations Oil for Food program, it became the main point of entry for humanitarian supplies. Every day, more than 3,500 tons of food, medicine, and essential goods passed through the docks, life-saving aid for a population suffering under heavy sanctions. This wasn't just a port, it was a pressure valve for a country on the brink and a symbol of Iraq's fragile link to the outside world. Whoever controlled Qasr would control not only access to the Gulf, but the lifeline feeding millions of Iraqis. For coalition planners, Qasr was one of the first dominoes that had to fall. Securing it would give Allied forces immediate access to a working seaport, vital for moving troops, gear, and humanitarian aid deeper into Iraq. The goal wasn't just to win battles, it was to build momentum, and Qasr was step one. The operation to take the town was assigned to a joint task force. Leading the charge were U.S. Marines from the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit, MEU, supported by British Royal Marines of the 3rd Commando Brigade. Polish Special Forces, known as GROM, also joined, bringing elite close-quarters combat skills to the mission. These three forces formed a tight, well-coordinated assault group trained for fast, high-risk entries. However, intelligence reports threw a curveball. Coalition surveillance suggested that tanks from the Iraqi Republican Guard, specifically the feared Medina Division, might have been sent to reinforce the area. Some units were reportedly seen near the main roads leading from Basra and Safwan, possibly cutting off Qasr from backup. If that intel was correct, the Marines wouldn't just face local militia, they'd be up against hardened, well-equipped army units. In response, U.S. commanders detached an armored unit to back up the 15th MEU. Brigadier Jim Dutton, the British officer coordinating ground efforts, prepared for a fight that could escalate quickly. As the invasion began, no one was sure what kind of resistance awaited at Qasr, but everyone knew it had to be taken, fast and clean. In the early morning of March 21, 2003, just as Operation Iraqi Freedom launched across the southern border, coalition forces turned their eyes to a key target, Qasr. The mission was straightforward: capture Iraq's only deep-water port and secure it for immediate use. The reality, however, was far more complicated. Leading the assault were the U.S. Marines of the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit. Backing them were Britain's 3rd Commando Brigade, well known for their amphibious capabilities, and Polish GROM commandos trained in lightning-fast, close-quarter engagements. Together, these forces approached the town from land and sea, ready to strike before the Iraqis could respond. At first, the operation appeared to go according to plan. Coalition vehicles moved in under the cover of darkness toward the new port district. But as the Marines pushed inland, Iraqi forces opened fire. Mortar shells began raining down, and small arms fire lit up from hidden positions among the buildings. The coalition quickly called in artillery support. British gunners responded, hitting Iraqi positions and helping to suppress the enemy fire. But the Marines were too close to the front lines to press forward safely. They had to pull back, regroup, and reinforce. 2 M1 Abrams tanks were added to the push. With their heavy armor leading the way, the Marines resumed their advance. The port zone was cleared block by block. Iraqi troops were poorly equipped and lacked coordination. Some surrendered immediately, around 200 in total, while others tried to resist and were quickly overrun. By the end of the day, coalition forces had seized the industrial port, but the fight wasn't over. The real test waited inland in the cramped, maze-like streets of the old town. After securing the industrial port, coalition troops turned their focus inland, toward the older part of Qasr. This was no open battlefield. The streets were narrow, the buildings close together, and visibility was limited. For U.S. and British troops, it meant abandoning the advantage of their vehicles and preparing for a street-by-street fight. At first, resistance seemed minimal. Coalition units advanced cautiously, clearing buildings and checking for signs of Iraqi fighters. Around 200 Iraqi soldiers had already surrendered at the port, and commanders hoped the rest might follow. But that hope faded quickly. As the Marines moved deeper into the town, sniper fire erupted. Shots echoed from rooftops and hidden corners. Iraqi fighters who had avoided the first wave of the assault were now using the terrain to their advantage. It became clear the defenders hadn't given up. They had only fallen back and prepared. One U.S. Marine was killed during the advance. It was a grim reminder that the fight for Qasr was far from over. The troops responded by tightening formations, using caution at every corner. Progress slowed as each building had to be cleared room by room. Despite the danger, coalition forces pressed on. Their goal was to push through the town and meet up with forces advancing from other directions. But by the end of the day, the coalition still hadn't fully secured the area. The defenders were putting up a fight, much more than anyone had expected for a small port town. By the morning of March 22nd, reports were already circulating that Qasr was under coalition control. Even U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced at a Pentagon press briefing that the port had been secured. But on the ground, the reality was far different. Coalition patrols pushing deeper into the old town quickly learned that the fighting was far from over. That same morning, a Marine patrol was ambushed by Iraqi snipers firing from the upper levels of abandoned buildings. What had started as a cleanup operation turned into an ongoing battle. Gunfire echoed through the streets, and every alley seemed like a potential trap. One group of Marines reported seeing Iraqi fighters move into a warehouse in the industrial zone. Tanks were called in and fired on the structure. However, the response wasn't enough. As the tanks pulled back, enemy fire intensified. Iraqi soldiers were using machine guns and RPGs to pin down coalition forces, making it nearly impossible to move forward safely. To break the deadlock, coalition commanders called in air support. Two RAF Harrier jets responded, launching airstrikes on the building and nearby sniper nests. The air attack did serious damage, reducing the volume of enemy fire, but it didn't end it. Snipers continued to harass patrols throughout the day. The situation escalated again on March 23rd. U.S. Navy SEALs and Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewmen, SWCC, teams began patrolling the waterways around Qasr. During one of these operations, they captured several dozen Iraqi fighters trying to flee in boats. Some of the prisoners were dressed as civilians, raising questions about whether they were combatants or fleeing commandos. Each detainee was handed over to British Royal Marines stationed in the area. Some were clearly trying to escape, but others may have been planning guerrilla attacks or preparing to regroup in nearby FAO. Despite the reinforcements and air support, coalition troops were still struggling to fully clear the town. Movement was slow, every intersection was dangerous, and soldiers had to assume that every window could conceal a rifle barrel. By the end of the 23rd, commanders realized the initial force wouldn't be able to finish the job alone. More troops would be needed. The next phase would require fresh units and a new approach. After 3 days of fighting and minimal progress inside Qasr's old town, coalition leadership made a decision. The U.S. Marines of the 15th MEU had been engaged from the start, and now they were scheduled to rejoin the main invasion force advancing toward Basra. To finish the mission in Qasr, British forces would take over. On the night of March the 24th, M Company of the British 42 Commando Royal Marines moved into position. These troops were fresh and well prepared for the type of close quarters, urban fighting that still loomed. That same night, they began patrolling through the remaining contested parts of the town. While sporadic gunfire still greeted them, organized resistance was fading fast. During these patrols, British forces discovered and cleared a Ba'ath Party headquarters in the center of town. The building was empty, abandoned by fleeing Iraqi fighters, but it stood as a symbol of the regime's fading grip. Elsewhere, Royal Marines swept through suspected defensive positions, finding weapons caches, empty bunkers, and signs that Iraqi troops had left in a hurry. By the afternoon of March 25th, the last parts of Qasr were cleared. The port and town were officially declared secure. Though intended as a quick operation, taking Qasr had taken 5 hard days. The coalition had its first clear win, but it came with valuable lessons about resistance, urban warfare, and the unpredictable nature of battle. With Qasr finally in coalition hands, attention turned to the port itself. Securing the docks was only half the job. Now the waterway had to be made safe for ships. Coalition forces needed the port operational as soon as possible, both to bring in humanitarian aid and to support the growing invasion force pushing into Iraq. The main threat was mines. Iraqi forces had laid dozens of them in the channel leading from the Gulf to the docks. If even one had gone undetected, it could sink a supply ship and shut down the route. Clearing them quickly and safely became a top priority. The Royal Navy deployed 2 mine-hunting ships, HMS Bangor and HMS Sandown, to sweep the channel. They were joined by U.S. Navy MH-53E Sea Dragon helicopters, designed to detect and remove underwater mines. Divers were sent in as well, along with an unusual but effective tool, trained dolphins capable of identifying submerged threats. The cleanup operation worked. Within days, the channel was declared clear. On March 28th, the British ship RFA Sir Galahad became the first vessel to dock at Qasr, carrying tons of humanitarian supplies. It was a major turning point. For the first time since the war began, aid could flow directly into Iraq by sea. The coalition hadn't just taken a town, they had opened a gateway. The reopening of Qasr's port wasn't just a military win, it was a humanitarian breakthrough. In the weeks leading up to the war, the people of Iraq had been bracing for chaos. Food, medicine, and fuel were already limited due to years of sanctions, and now with fighting underway, those supplies were at risk of being cut off entirely. The United Nations Oil for Food program had funneled critical aid into Iraq for years, and Qasr had been one of its main entry points. With the channel cleared and secured, that aid could finally resume and even increase. The first ships carried everything from sacks of grain to medical equipment, clean water, and emergency shelter materials. For many families in southern Iraq, this was the first sign of relief in what had quickly become a war zone. But bringing supplies in was only part of the equation. Coalition forces had to ensure the port stayed safe. Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewmen, SWCC, patrolled the waterways around Qasr, using fast boats to intercept threats and escort incoming vessels. Their presence prevented sabotage or attacks and kept the supply chain flowing smoothly. Thanks to these efforts, Qasr became the main artery for humanitarian relief in southern Iraq. The port allowed aid organizations and coalition forces to deliver vital goods at a critical moment. For many Iraqis, what arrived through those docks meant the difference between hunger and hope. Even after the last shots were fired in Qasr, the port remained a vital hub for months, and even years after the initial invasion. Coalition forces kept a strong presence there, using the town as a launching point for further operations into southern Iraq. Engineers began work on stabilizing and upgrading the port infrastructure almost immediately. In May 2003, control of port operations was officially handed back to Iraqi authorities. But coalition support didn't end. Over the next several years, reconstruction teams continued to dredge the channel, expand docking capacity, and improve security systems. The goal was clear: turn Qasr into a functioning commercial port that could support not just military needs, but Iraq's long-term recovery. Qasr also left behind a lasting military lesson. What had been expected to be a quick and simple operation turned into a week-long fight. The resistance faced there, especially in the tight urban quarters, forced coalition planners to rethink how cities would be taken later in the campaign. For the Iraqi people, Qasr became a symbol of both struggle and survival. It was the first real battleground of the war, but also the first to reopen and help rebuild. In many ways, Qasr became the war's starting point and its first turning point. The Battle of Qasr was never meant to be long or costly. It was supposed to be a quick strike, a clean entry into Iraq through its only deep-water port. But instead, it became the first reminder that war, even with the best planning, rarely goes as expected. What began as an amphibious landing turned into a tense, drawn-out urban fight. Coalition troops, U.S. Marines, British Royal Marines, and Polish GROM faced not just gunfire, but snipers, ambushes, and hidden resistance that dragged the battle into its fifth day. The victory came, but not without loss, not without delay, and not without a warning about what lay ahead. Still, the success at Qasr carried real weight. Securing the port opened a lifeline into Iraq. Humanitarian aid flowed in through the docks, easing suffering and stabilizing southern regions in the early days of the conflict. The port's reopening was not just a military achievement, it was a humanitarian one. Qasr also set the tone for what kind of war the coalition would face. The fight wouldn't be limited to open deserts. It would happen in towns, alleys, stairwells, and streets. Small places, big risks. And yet, through that first test, the coalition held firm. They adapted, regrouped, and pushed forward. Today, Qasr may not be as well known as Baghdad or Fallujah, but it was where the Iraq War truly began. It was the first battle, the first victory, and a powerful reminder that even small places can carry the weight of history.